Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Well, I want to thank the Veritas Forum for this opportunity. It's been a real pleasure working with the organizers. I want to thank Dr. Hutchinson for coming all this way just to talk to me. And thank you all for your time and attention today. So, a little over a year ago, a Seventh-day Adventist minister named Ryan Bell decided that his doubts about God's existence were too strong for him to continue preaching the gospel in good faith. So he stepped aside from a position he'd occupied for many years and announced on his blog that he was going to spend 1 year without God and see what happened. He was widely denounced online for this. He says that he keeps a massive folder of hate mail from his Christian brothers and sisters who don't approve of this experiment. And that 1-year experiment concluded just, I believe, in January, when he announced that he had officially overcome his faith and that he was no longer a believer. Now, about the same time he was launching this 1-year experiment, a man named Ken Ham, the founder of Answers in Genesis, a Christian evangelical group, was debating Bill Nye, the science guy, on whether creationism should be taught in public schools. In the question and answer period of that debate, both participants, Nye and Ham, were asked, what would change your mind? Bill Nye had a very simple answer. He said, evidence. Ken Ham's response was, I'm a Christian. Nobody's going to convince me to change my mind about Christ. Now, I want to contrast, I'd like you to join me in contrasting the attitudes of these two men. Ryan Bell was very candid with himself and with his fellow parishioners and with the leadership of his church about his loss of faith. He was curious about what it would be like to spend a year without worship, without Bible study, without church attendance, without prayer. And he was experimental. And I think in all of these respects, he exemplified the scientific attitude. He was willing to try something and see what happened, and actually look on what happened with an open mind. Contrast that with the defiant refusal to change his mind that was at the heart of Ken Ham's response. He basically had made up his mind that he already knew the truth. His faith licensed him to close his mind to all other possibilities. And his tenacious avowal that he was utterly unwilling to rethink his position elicited great praise from fellow members of his Christian faith. He was applauded wildly in some circles for this deep expression of his unwavering faith. Now, it seems to me that the behavior of these two men are just nearly perfect exemplars of the scientific attitude in the first case and the attitude of faith in the second. I have a question for each of you. Which attitude do you think we should bring to the issue before us today? Ken Ham's attitude or Ryan Bell's attitude? I'll take a quick poll here. How many of you think that to get at the truth about the question of whether faith has a role in the scientific worldview, how many of you think it would be better to approach that question, to address that question with Ken Ham's style, with Ken Ham's attitude? Anybody?
Evidence.
Evidence?
Is that what it is? We're asking evidence-based or faith-based?
Ken Ham's view was nothing will change my mind.
Oh.
So I was asking you, how many of you think that's the best approach to our issue today? I didn't see anybody raising it. How many of you think that the more experimental, open-minded attitude exemplified by Ryan Bell is the appropriate attitude to bring to the issue before us today? So I would propose that we approach this question together and try to gain some insight, and then actually let our convictions about the role of faith in science be affected by what we learn in the process. So let's examine this question together. Notice a couple things about the question, is there a role for faith in the scientific worldview? Number one, it's a question about faith, not a question about any of the secular cousins of faith, such as trust, hopefulness, resolve, confidence. We all know that the word faith is used sometimes interchangeably with these other concepts that have a perfectly good use in secular contexts. And there's no question at all, I think, in the mind of either me or any of my secular friends, that hope and trust and confidence and resolve and things like that do have a role in human life generally, and ipso facto a role in science as a consequence. But that's not the question here, because all sides agree that those have a role. The question here before us is whether religious faith has a role in science. That's the only pointed issue. Notice also that the question asks us to reflect on whether this attitude of faith has a role not in the lives of particular scientists, but whether it has a role in the scientific worldview that scientists together build. I don't doubt that faith has an important role, plays an important role in the lives of many individual scientists. Again, that's not at issue. The issue is whether it has a role in the shared construction of a worldview that we can all rely upon together because it is firmly evidence-based. That's the question. And finally, the question asks whether faith actually has a role in this formation and maintenance of this worldview. It's not, the question is not whether it can be appended or adjoined to a certain set of scientific attitudes as kind of an appendage. The question is whether it actually has a functional role to play. Now, so if you combine all of these together, I think what we get is the following question. Does religious faith have an important functional role to play in the formation and maintenance of the evidence-based worldview that the scientific community as a whole seeks to construct and maintain? And it seems to me that the answer to that question is quite clearly no. And I think if you look at the question with an open mind, you'll reach the same conclusion. What am I doing with time?
You got 3 more minutes.
I do lose track of time, as was mentioned before. So before you decide, yes, that faith does in fact have a role in the scientific worldview, in science, I'd like to ask you certain questions. If it does in fact have such a role, an important functional role, you should be able to identify it. Tell us what exactly this role is, and how is it that religious faith is needed to play that role, as opposed to the secular cousin attitudes like hope and trust that we all acknowledge has a role. In other words, anybody who would defend the view that it does have a role should be able to specify clearly and concisely what that role is. And if faith in God has a role in the scientific worldview, then why not faith in Zeus? If faith in Zeus has a role in the scientific worldview, why not faith in the tooth fairy? I don't mean to be flip here, and I don't mean to equate faith in God with faith in the tooth fairy, but there are similarities between the two cases that, in particular, neither of those beliefs, belief in the tooth fairy or belief in God, has met the evidential standards that scientists share. So suppose that a shared faith in the sun god Ra were to deliver all of the same functional benefits of faith in Jesus. Maybe it inspires hope and trust and confidence among those who have that faith, and it has many social and psychological benefits. Maybe, if so, would faith in the sun god Ra earn a place within the scientific worldview? Notice what a perverse conclusion that would be. Because if so, the sun god Ra merits a place in the scientific worldview, belief in Zeus merits a place in the scientific worldview, and belief in many incompatible gods would all merit a place in what is supposed to be one and the same shared world and coherent worldview. I'm not sure science can survive the admission of beliefs that don't measure up to certain standards of rational accountability. So if we allow faith into science or the scientific worldview, how do we keep superstition from affecting medical science? How do we keep astrology from infecting astronomy? How do we keep creationism from corrupting biology? How do we keep fairy tales from corrupting history? My claim is that attitudes like Ken Ham's are in fact deeply subversive of the scientific enterprise. They close minds and prevent people from inquiring about the world openly and honestly. I think that attitudes like Ham's are deeply antithetical to curiosity, the main driver of science. Look at the fact that people of faith routinely claim to know things they can't possibly know, like Jesus was born of a virgin. Where's the intellectual humility and where's the intellectual honesty in that? And does faith, in fact, encourage people to adopt attitudes that are lacking in humility and intellectual honesty? It seems to me at the very heart of civil society is a norm that says, if you have the better reason, I will yield. When people start flaunting that norm, the fabric of society begins to fray. And the one function of faith talk that is used again and again and again is to excuse people from that norm, is to exempt people from that norm. In almost every areas of our lives, we expect people to provide good reasons. But when it's a matter of religious faith, we say, oh, you don't need reasons. It's enough to have faith. I think that is a very destructive attitude to take. We would do better to leave it behind.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. Thank you also for arranging a little sprinkle of snow to make a Boston resident feel at home. Is there a role for faith in a scientific worldview? Let's talk about what faith is, and let's talk about what a scientific worldview is, since Andy has talked about those. The topic we've been asked to address is not actually quite the question that I would have phrased it. When we talk about a worldview, we generally mean a set of metaphysical presuppositions that guide the way we think and act. In a sense, as soon as you start to talk about a worldview, you're talking about something that involves faith, because it involves a system of presuppositions that are unproved and often unprovable. So the answer to the question as posed, I would claim, is obviously yes, faith is essential to every worldview. And so I want to avoid that tautology because I don't think that's a very interesting conversation. So I would have phrased the question more like, is there a role for faith in science or in understanding the world through science? And I think that's consistent with the way that Andy has pushed the conversation. So I'm glad of that. Another reason why I shy away from the phrase scientific worldview is that although I'm undoubtedly a scientist, I would not say that my worldview is a scientific worldview. One shouldn't imply that scientists necessarily have a scientific worldview. Did the famous scientists of history have a scientific worldview? Did Kepler or Galileo or Boyle or Newton or Dalton or Faraday or Maxwell have a scientific worldview? The answer is no. If by holding a scientific worldview, one means that one's metaphysical presuppositions are that natural science is the royal route to knowledge, or it's the most important knowledge, or that nature and the material is all there is, then none of those opinions were held by those great scientists that I mentioned. They were all Christians. What's more, I and a large number of modern scientists also don't hold those naturalist presuppositions. I think that natural science is extremely important knowledge, powerful way of understanding the normal workings of the world, and it's the type of knowledge that gives rise to technology. But I explicitly reject the scientism that supposes that science is all the real knowledge there is. And if you want to know more about this, you have to read my book.
On sale in the lobby.
There are vast reaches of human knowledge, such as history, philosophy, music, economics, politics, aesthetics, jurisprudence, and so on, that don't share the methods of or bear much resemblance to natural science. And yet they have true knowledge. Scientism, the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is, despite its widespread influence today, is simply an intellectual mistake. Now let's talk about faith. I think we've been offered a caricature of faith so far, and I want to address this more directly. The word faith has several different but very much related meanings. And I think they can be summarized as being of three different types. First of all, belief without proof in a proposition or a system of propositions. Secondly, faith can mean confidence or trust in a person or thing. And thirdly, faith can mean loyalty to some person or ideal. Now in Christianity, all three meanings apply, but the emphasis is on the second and third meanings, trust and loyalty. Notice, though, that faith is not inherently religious, contrary to what it has been suggested. It can be perfectly secular. I had faith, in the sense of placing confidence or trust, in the airplane that I flew down from Boston on this morning. I also have faith, meaning trust, in my wife, and I seek to act in faith, in the sense of loyalty, towards her. Now what about, though, this first meaning that I suggested, the belief without proof in propositions? Usually, this is the meaning of faith that the anti-theists of today attack. They portray faith as Mark Twain's schoolboy's definition. The schoolboy, when asked to define faith according to Mark Twain, said, "Faith is believing what you know ain't true." They speak as if religious people are like the White Queen in Alice Through the Looking Glass, who said that she could believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. They speak as if there is a simple choice, that you can base your beliefs on faith, or you can base them on evidence. So they speak of faith-based beliefs and evidence-based beliefs, meaning beliefs that have no evidentiary justification and beliefs that have evidentiary justification. Well, obviously, if you have a simple choice between those two types of beliefs, it's surely preferable to go for evidence. But that's a false choice. In the first place, we as humans are obliged all the time to make decisions based on minimal evidence beyond our impulses and personal preferences. We do so because we must. There's no time for the careful weighing of evidence for every decision in the hustle and bustle of daily life. And moreover, even for major life decisions, for which we take the time to think deeply, like what job should we take, or what should we major at in college, or who we should marry, or where we should live, for those decisions even, there's, generally speaking, insufficient evidence to make a totally rational decision. If you want to know if your boyfriend loves you, I strongly urge that you do not plan some careful bank of psychological tests to find out. Notice that I'm not saying we should ignore the evidence in answering questions. Of course not. But eventually we have to move forward one way or the other without sufficient evidence to justify all of our decisions. And people who do that, who act with determination and commitment, even in the face of uncertainty and limited evidential support, not having all the answers, those types of people are often called men and women of action. They act decisively in ways that are consistent with their underlying beliefs, commitments, and principles, using what they do know, even in situations where no one knows what the right answer is and where whether success is attainable. And that's a very important practice of faith. And I would argue that religious faith, at its best, is the same principle applied to matters of the Spirit. So that's the first reason why that's not a true choice. Secondly, it follows from what I've just said that it's completely unjustified to suppose that faith always means belief in contradiction to the evidence, or even without evidence. Belief without proof is not the same thing as belief without evidence. I, as a Christian, have evidence that supports my belief that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, died and was raised again on the third day. It's important to recognize that that evidence is mostly not scientific evidence. It couldn't possibly be scientific evidence because the question is not a scientific question. It's mostly a historical question. The historical evidence for the resurrection is stronger than for many events of the ancient world that are accepted as uncontroversial. I'm not saying that the resurrection is obviously true, but I am saying there's serious evidence for it. And therefore, a stark contrast between faith-based and evidence-based can't be maintained in respect to this question or many other questions. Instead, what you have to do in respect of these types of questions is to ask how good is the evidence that supports it. And that's an assessment which I think the Christian faith bears very well. Now, another discussion of this question of faith involves what can be thought of as a combination of those two meanings. The belief in propositions and trust in persons. It's often said that religious beliefs are based on faith in authority, that people believe Christianity, it's said, because they've been taught by their religious authority figures, like their church pastors, and they believe and trust those figures. Now, this bears also on the question of the authority of the Bible. It's the same type of combination. The Bible is accepted, in part, by Christians because it's recognized by people we know and trust, and others who've been trusted over history, as being reliable testimony and a guide to life. Well, the question is, should we consider authority like that to be a reliable guide to truth? And I think the anti-theists, by and large, would say no. Now, I'd be the first to say that natural science is ultimately not based on authority, but on experiment and observation. That's true. And there's therefore a true sense in which the move to rely upon reproducible experiment and observation is what makes natural science what it is. So then, perhaps the question is, shouldn't we throw off any reliance on authority and confidence in the guidance of others and develop one's own beliefs? I mean, this is a fair question, but the answer isn't so obvious. First, the answer isn't so obvious, as I mentioned already, because not all knowledge is science. So not all knowledge can be based on that kind of scientific evidence. But secondly, it's impossible not to rely, to some extent, on authority, even in science. It's certainly true that the religious beliefs of many non-intellectuals is founded on an acceptance of what they are taught by their religious authorities. That's true. And yet it is just as true that their scientific beliefs are an acceptance of the teachings of their scientific authorities. So it's entirely parallel. Does that mean that they should reject both religion and science? I mean, if authority is the problem with religion, why is it not a problem with science? From the viewpoint of the average Joe, there's really not a lot to choose between the two in respect of authority. And in fact, actually, for serious religious believers, it's likely that they're better educated and therefore able to form their own opinion about what their religion is rather than what their science beliefs are. In other words, their religious beliefs are, on the face of it, less dependent on external authority than their scientific beliefs. Well, my time is up, so I must wrap up. Is there a role for faith in science? Answer is yes. In fact, faith is inescapable even in science. Thank you.
Well, this is two wonderful talks, and now I get a chance to lead discussion between you guys. I'd love to hear your response to the other side's presentation, and Andy, maybe it makes sense to start with you since we're more recent. Do you have any questions you would like to ask Ian following his presentation?
Thank you. By the way, lovely talking. Thank you very much. So it sounds like we agree on a fair bit. And I'll start by, acknowledging your rejection of scientism. I think it's quite correct to say that we know many things quite independent of the institution of science. At the moment, for example, I know that there's a tingling in my left elbow, and science has nothing whatsoever to do with my knowledge of that. Right? And it only takes one example to show that scientism is so refined. As follows.
Sorry, is that better? Is that better?
Would you like me to repeat his talk?
Yes, Zeus.
So I guess my question is, so if not all knowledge comes from science, would you at least grant that knowledge comes to deserve the name by meeting recognized measures of rational accountability?
Recognized measures of rational accountability. That's what you get from philosophers, sorry.
Perhaps I should apologize.
Look, of course, we should pay attention to what we know. We should pay attention to critical thought, to evidence. We should think things through, and we should naturally try the best we can to follow evidence. But there are lots of areas of life where people make claims about knowledge that they can't demonstrate by evidence. Okay? And you indicted in your talk, you talked about superstition and beliefs, claims of knowledge that Christians have, say, about the resurrection, which is one claim I would make at least.
I've suggested there's actually evidence for the resurrection. But you know, there are lots of things in our lives that we claim to know. We claim to know that it is just to imprison criminals. We claim to know that it's a travesty to force children to work in slave conditions. There are lots of things that we claim to know in our lives that are not things we can demonstrate scientifically or by evidence. And so I just don't accept that there is this difference. There is this magical approach which is somehow evidence-based, which overthrows all commitments. In science too, you know, there is a sense of commitment. Scientists like often to speak as if there were any evidence to contradict what we take to be the laws of physics and so on and so forth, that we would immediately, you know, overthrow them. But actually, Thomas Kuhn, for example, showed very carefully in his analysis what scientists actually do, is that isn't what they do. Scientists develop a sort of faith, a sort of conviction about their theories and about their understanding of the world, which is much more robust than being immediately overthrown when there's contrary evidence. And so science has a sense of faith built into it. And so if someone comes up to me and says, look, I got this demonstration, you know, that Maxwell's equations aren't actually true, that it's something else, you know, I'm going to be highly skeptical about that, and however good the evidence might be, I'm going to hold to my belief that actually Maxwell's equations are a true description of the world. And so scientists, in many situations, are defensive or have trust and confidence in their theories in ways that are not so terribly different from the ways in which people have in religion.
So I think everything you're saying is true, but surely you'll acknowledge that there's a difference, and an important difference, between having a certain measure of commitment in, say, a given theory, and wedding yourself, committing yourself to a certain, say, supernatural belief, and refusing even to consider the possibility that you're wrong. Now, it seems to me that faith talk, I mean, will you acknowledge that at least that the celebration of faith often opens the door to attitudes like Ken Ham's, and that those attitudes really are corrosive of what we're trying to do in science?
Well, first of all, I watched the debate, okay? How many people watched the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate? A few, okay. It wasn't that interesting, but Ken Ham was actually much better prepared than Bill Nye, so even though I don't adopt Ken Ham's viewpoint, Ken Ham is not just some crass, you know, guy who hasn't thought about things. He actually prepares himself very carefully for these debates. I don't subscribe to his views by and large. Certainly, I think that the universe is old, and you know, so on and so forth. So I'm not on the same side of those scientific arguments. But I think you sort of portrayed him a little bit unfairly. So let's just simply take Ken Ham out of the discussion and say, is there a case for a kind of belief that is mere believism? In other words, I put my faith in this concept, and no one's going to argue me out of it. Okay? I think that there are some branches of Christianity, for example, in which some of the pastors speak like that some of the time. But I think historically that is not how Christianity has portrayed itself. And I think in large, how could that possibly be the case? You know, when the fact is that most of the universities that were founded prior to the current, you know, the last 150 years, were in fact Christian religious foundations. How could it possibly be true that what we take to be the academic enterprise was essentially founded by Christianity, the institutions of Christianity, if in fact it is the natural behavior of Christianity to argue in ways that are mere believism. So, yes, there are the Kenhams of this world, if we go back to Mr. Kenham, or there are people who adopt a kind of believist attitude. But I think to portray that as being typical of the religious viewpoint is perhaps unfair. The other point to make is, there's plenty of that is purely secular. I'm from Boston. We have a thing up there called Red Sox Nation. The people up there have faith in the Red Sox, and that faith is mere believism, okay? A lot of the time they have no evidence to support it.
In the way to help these guys understand that is to talk about Steelers Nation.
Sorry, I would have learned it.
And by the way, I suffer from that particular faith. and I don't claim that it's my most rational.
So Ian, could I let you have the same privilege? Did you have any questions for Andy based on his?
Well, I think Andy has actually focused on this question of attitude, and I think we probably really exercise that more as much as we need to. But I do want to insist that there are if you are talking about faith generally, it isn't terribly helpful, I don't think. Maybe you'd like to comment on this, to identify religious faith as some kind of unique type of faith, because as I tried to illustrate just now with my reference to sport, I actually do think that human nature has lots of ways of approaching of our beliefs, and that the religious beliefs are not unique in the way that you've suggested they are. But so what would you say?
Yeah, thank you for that's right. It seems to me that the concept of faith functions primarily in the following way. It absorbs many positive connotations from its cousin concepts like trust and hope and loyalty and resolve. And it takes those positive associations and it translates them over and uses them to afford an excuse for tenacious refusals to meet basic standards of rational accountability. And if you actually pay close attention to the way the word faith functions in that context, I think that it's actually functioning that way in Dr. Hutchinson's argument. I mean, yes, of course, hope and trust and loyalty and confidence play very important roles in human life. But to take all of those concepts, credit faith with originating those attitudes, and then say, oh, well, then it's okay to have faith in unseen supernatural forces as well. That seems to me a very problematic step. What I'm trying to do is to call attention to the way in which the concept of faith functions in this way, and the way in which it excuses sometimes gross evasions from rational accountability. And maybe I can be persuaded that certain uses of faith talk are important and worthwhile, and that the phenomena referred to there are to be celebrated and upheld. But if so, if we're going to allow that, how are we going to draw a line between those beneficial forms of faith and the clearly pernicious ones that we both recognize as well? And I think this is a problem that everybody who cares about rational accountability, everybody who cares about science, needs to address. And if you're going to throw open the doors of science and say, oh, come on, faith is allowed here, you have to provide some account of how you're going to prevent superstition and other anti-rational attitudes from subverting the scientific enterprise.
I don't think the scientific enterprise is so easily subverted. I actually have greater confidence in it, perhaps, than is often expressed by those who worry about it being subverted. I think science, it's important to understand what science is. Natural science, which is what I mean when I use the unqualified word science, is basically about trying to understand the world insofar as it is reproducible and it can be expressed in terms of measurements and related properties that have a certain degree of clarity. And those properties of natural science, those characteristics of natural science, upon which natural science depends, I haven't got time to unpack that, seem to me to be both the power of science and what gives science its ability to come to a high degree of consensus on questions, and also give it the power to produce technology, which is perhaps one of the most convincing things about science. But they also, in my view, constitute a substantial restriction or limitation of the competence of science. So if science is not omnicompetent, which I think we've agreed it isn't, okay, then I think it's important to recognize that there must therefore be lots of other things in our lives that science is not competent to decide questions of. And it's not simply a matter of science versus religion. You could just as well ask the question, should we allow ethics into science? And some scientists think you shouldn't, but I think they're dead wrong, okay? So I mean, you could also talk about the relationship between science and aesthetics, Is there a scientific way to determine the beauty of something? So I think these are examples of things in our lives where we have definite opinions, and these opinions aren't always shared, okay? And they're hard to come to some consensus over, but they're vital parts of what we are as humans, and they're not something which ultimately you can decide on the basis of science. So that's.
Let me pick up on that a little bit. And with a question for each of you, and since I'm holding the mic, I get to ask the first questions. One question I had was, what would it take for us to use the rational method to conclude that God exists?
If Santa Claus and his reindeer landed on my roof tomorrow, I would believe in Santa Claus. And if the clouds parted and God stuck his head through the clouds and said, "Hey, Andy, you've been wrong all these years," I would have to concede that I'd be wrong. So that would be a very simple empirical case of overturning my belief.
So Ian, to you, why doesn't God reveal himself to us by parting the clouds and stepping forward? I mean, why doesn't God give us more evidence that he exists?
So how many times does he have to do it? I mean, that sounds like a flippant question, but I think it's a serious question.
It's certainly possible. So a single experience, direct experience of God's presence, I think should not count as a decisive proof of God's existence, because we know that the human brain is capable of generating illusions. In fact, profoundly religious and spiritual experiences are often, you can actually stimulate the human brain with electrodes in ways that give people religious experiences.
Why would you therefore believe the Santa Claus on your roof, or the God who puts his head through the clouds? You just said, you just contradicted yourself. I don't mean to make...
No. It's a fair question.
So here's my answer to the question, okay? Religious people claim that God has revealed himself, okay, number one, and they testify to that. And the fact of the matter is, no religious experience, whether it's of the type of God appearing through the clouds or of the type that religious believers per se, is self-authenticating to anyone be outside the individual, or even, ultimately, to the individual themselves, because they can always say, I had a hallucination, okay? But that is the situation for almost anything that is not something that is in the normal course of events. Science pursues the normal course of events, and so if I do an experiment here, someone can do the experiment somewhere else and get the same answer. So that's the way we can verify. But religious experience, miracle and related questions, those types of things are inherently unreproducible. And so they are not things that you can verify through science. And so science, in my view, is incompetent to prove the existence of God in the way that it, investigates the other things in the natural world. And so I would say that, that relationship is a very important one to recognize.
I guess, why wouldn't God allow himself to be proven in that way? I mean, why wouldn't he allow us to have enough evidence to demonstrate to nice people like Andy?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. First of all, I don't know for sure how God sees it. But I will say this. I think that if experiencing relating to God is relating to a person as opposed to relating to, a law of nature, then it's going to be inherently the case that it's more difficult to be persuaded of the reliability of that, because our persuasion of the reliability of persons or of the reproducibility of persons is inherently less than it is for inanimate objects. So I think that's one answer to the question, is that if God is a person, then the only way you're ultimately going to be persuaded of the existence or affability or beneficence of that person is to have a relationship with that person.
So let me actually ask the question I had for you during your talk. So Andy you said that scientific beliefs are the result of scientific authorities.
I said that for the average Joe it is.
Okay. But I guess from a perspective, you could say that at least with a scientific belief, I can go back and test it to see if it's true or not. So going
the
to
average
Andy's,
Joe can't go back and test it. Scientists can go back and test it.
Okay.
But I would argue that the same kind of argument applies in terms of religious knowledge. Okay, except that religious knowledge is not a knowledge of the natural world. So that's the key difference. So you can't go back and test it because it's not testable, it's not reproducible, okay? So what I would argue is that each of us holds our beliefs on the basis of a mixture of authority, experience, rational thought, philosophy, what feels good, and those kinds of things. All of those things go into making up our beliefs. And those of us who are academics place high value, on the kind of rational thought approach to it, and including, scientific testing and so forth. But that's true also in theology. I mean, theologians, professional theologians, spend a lot of time thinking rationally about God. I mean, but for most people, the fact is that we accept a large fraction of our beliefs on the basis of the authority of people we trust.
So I want to acknowledge that. That's right. It's quite true that scientists frequently take the testimony of their peers on authority. They accept the authority of their scientific peers. But I wonder, Ian, if you'd acknowledge this. I think what a scientist should say about that is that I'm happy to acknowledge earned authority. And if somebody has gone through a rigorous scientific training, published papers in peer-reviewed journals and had done all the other things to earn the trust of the scientific community, then that's a kind of earned authority that we should respect. Now contrast that with the kind of authority that, for example, religious charlatans often avail themselves of, right? They claim to be talking, we know, no matter what faith you belong to, you can find dozens of examples of faiths where a charlatan of some kind used a claim of direct access to God and his will to hoodwink many, many people out of their money and into being followers of that person. Now, clearly that's an abuse of an authority gained through sort of an unearned source. I hope I'm not offending any Mormons here, but Joseph Smith was known to have engaged in fraud before he ever founded the Mormon Church. Now, I mean, that's evidence, and it's relevant to whether or not Joseph Smith's word should count as authoritative. Now, think about the fact that when atheists like me raise questions about religious faith, we're often denounced as being disrespectful. We're often denounced as being sort of insufficiently deferential to people's to things that people consider sacred. Now, you have to ask yourself, to what extent does scripture and religious conviction shield itself from genuine accountability and thereby take advantage of a huge measure of unearned deference, right? It seems to me that religions have many, many conceptual mechanisms for discouraging people from questioning and really testing their beliefs, and thereby manage to escape the kind of scrutiny and testing that we demand of beliefs in every other area of our lives. And this is a recipe for dogmatism. It's a recipe for closed-mindedness. It's a recipe for, when views like this held sway during the Middle Ages, science didn't progress for almost 1,000 years. When the church authorities of the Christian church got control of the universities in Europe, go back and read the writings of the theologians of the time. They're so utterly lacking in genuine curiosity about their world, it's almost shocking. They somehow, their attitudes of faith managed to discourage the kind of creativity, humility, and honest questioning that we know makes science go. And there's a reason why they call it the Dark Ages.
Well, I just have to come back on that. I can't let that go on. First of all, I'm dead against charlatans. I'm against religious charlatans. I'm against scientific charlatans, okay? Secondly, though, what you just said is simply false history. The idea that theology and science have been at war is an invention, essentially, of the 19th century. It's a myth that has been dispelled by responsible historians throughout the final half of the 20th century and into this century. And so to portray that as being characteristic of to portray that warfare and to speak about the church holding back science for thousands of years, this is false history. I don't accept that. And you need to do some homework before you start talking about that in the area of the relationship between science and the development of ideas of science generally, science history.
So in a second, you guys are going to get a chance to ask questions of our participants. Let me if it's okay, let me ask the last question, going back to your original point about the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate, and asking a similar question, if you'll allow me to. And you may have already answered this, but what would it take, both of you, and I'll start with you, Andy, to change your position on this issue?
Yeah, the example of God sticking his head through the clouds is I mean, I'm being partially facetious there, right? But the point is that it would not be hard for an omnipotent God to present himself in such a way as to satisfy the entire scientific community about his existence, if he wanted to. As to personal things, I mean, perhaps Ian is correct that I shouldn't accept God's existence on the basis of a single unitary experience. After all, I could be deluding myself in a case like that. But again, I want to express my, in principle, willingness to change my mind in the face of what seem to me to be good reasons and evidence. There are probably many, many scenarios on which such evidence would amount to enough to tip the scales in my mind. But nothing even approaching that has occurred in my experience.
Could I pose the same question to you?
Yeah. I'm a Christian predominantly because I think it's true that Christ rose from the dead on the third day. That's a core belief of Christians, I think, everywhere. And I think, for example, if incontrovertible evidence arose to show that the resurrection did not take place, I would come to the conclusion that I was mistaken in my belief, and that Jesus was not the Son of God, and that he didn't rise from the dead on the third day, and that the Christian experience of the last 2,000 years has been a psychological aberration. Okay? I don't think that it's likely that such evidence could be forthcoming, but it would certainly, I think, be sufficient to persuade me. On the other hand, it's important to recognize that no system of beliefs and metaphysical perspectives is upheld by a single piece of evidence. I don't think that's true for you, and I don't think it's true for me. Okay? But I do think that one could undermine a Christian belief by the unequivocal disproof of some events like that.
Unless you can Ham.
You know, I think you're very hard on Ken Ham. I mean,
just taking him at his word. I mean, that's what he said.
I mean, look, what's the guy going to say? He doesn't think it's possible to prove that Christ didn't raise from the dead. He doesn't even think it's possible to prove that the earth is older than 6,000 years. So he's kind of stuck, you know.
Let's thank you both. Let's thank our speakers again. So again, now we have questions from the floor. My understanding is I'm about to lose my microphone. But before I do, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. If you prefer to remain anonymous, apparently you can text your questions to that number. And I will now lose my microphone. Okay. Oh, and I guess the other thing I should say is I will take the privilege of please make your question a question, not a speech. I've discovered that if you can't frame your question in about 15 seconds, it's probably not a question.
Okay. So, what is the role of faith in science? Briefly, what specifically is it?
What is the role of faith in science? It is, as it is in other areas, a conviction based on a general perspective that enables you to exercise your rationality to try to evaluate the extent to which experience does or doesn't prove to be consistent.
So what about specifically religious faith?
Well, specifically religious faith, in my view, doesn't have a day-to-day role to play in science. However, actually, the relationship between science and religious faith is far more constructive than was portrayed earlier. And a good case can be made that actually the Christian or the biblical, let's say, worldview served as a kind of fertile philosophical and indeed theological environment in which modern science as we know it got going. I haven't got time to unpack that, but a number of people have spoken about this and argued, I think fairly cogently, that it's interesting to note that science grew up in a worldview in which the biblical perspective on creation held sway. And there are good reasons for supposing that to have had a rather constructive influence in the foundation of science.
Other questions?
Oh, we got a lot. Yeah, you got loads. You got to point them out.
Do you believe that God should be discussed within scientific journals and in the conclusions that scientists present to their peers in the scientific community?
Is this a question to me or to him?
To both of you.
I'll say no.
I think largely not. And in fact, the practice of science, generally speaking, doesn't exercise that kind of activity. Doesn't mean that science is godless, although sometimes it is. But anyway, so that's my...
Where's our mic? Any questions in the back? We have one right down here.
Hi, this is for Professor Norman. I've kind of written down a few things. So I'm a Christian, and one of the things that kind of struck me was what you were saying about, I guess, scholarly credibility, gaining your PhD, getting your degree, things like that. But I feel like a lot of the times that you were still trying to take what science is very base, very earn your degree and get whatever, and versus where religion is like what Professor Hutchinson is very individual. For example, if I were to say that of the 12 disciples, none of them really had PhDs or anything like that, but they did miraculous work. They made huge changes, and Jesus specifically chose these people for certain things. So my question to you is, do you believe it's possible to be credible without a degree?
Absolutely.
What program are you in? No, I'm teasing.
Yeah, I mean, look, it seems to me that, I mean, it's part of the scientific way of thinking to respect a well-reasoned argument, even if it comes from somebody who isn't credentialed. And in fact, I think highly credentialed people can make lousy arguments. I know I've made many, and not today though. And so, I mean, in part, science teaches its adherents and its practitioners to not just take somebody's say-so on the basis of their authority. If somebody has a good point to make, really listen to that point and give it the credit it deserves, regardless of the source.
We had a question here, or you choose. You choose. Oh, okay.
That's just to tease you.
I guess my question is, why does it matter if there is a God or there is not a God? For instance, if somebody has an experience that some might describe as religious or some might describe as like hallucinatory, why does that even matter?
Well, perhaps I should take this one. It matters because, if true, Christianity it talks about things of enormous value, of enormous significance, that can transform lives. And so certainly Christians would say that the reality of Jesus is important to our lives today, but also for eternity. And so I think that's the reason why historically people have considered religion to be very important. Religion also has, of course, many other influences on our society. But from the point of view of a religious believer, the claim is that there are matters here of ultimate importance.
Just to tack on a thought, my brother-in-law once got so tired of my wanting to talk about these issues of reason and faith and God, and he declared himself an apatheist. I don't care if God exists or not, he said. But I agree with Dr. Hutchinson on this. A great deal rides on whether or not these beliefs, these theological beliefs, affect our thinking and our acting, and I think it has a huge, it will have a huge effect on the future of human civilization, how we answer these questions.
I'm not going to sleep well at night if we don't let the guy we teased ask a question.
Hi. This is mostly to Dr. Norman. And I'm talking about one kind of faith which is...
Hold it to you.
I'm talking specifically of one kind of faith, which is religious faith. You've mentioned a couple of times that if you had proof that it does good, then you might convert. And believe me, I don't have any interest of converting you into a priest.
Can I just make it's demonstration that a given belief is beneficial or that it's good making would not in itself prove that it's true, nor would it show that it belongs in a scientific worldview. Aside from that, I'm with you.
What is true, though, is that it has a purpose to do a lot of good. And in some cases, it has done a lot of good for a lot of people. For instance, the miracles is an example, etc., etc. So for them, there's lots of evidence that God does exist. And he's talked to the same people over and over again. So there is evidence of both God existing to some people, and they're not charlatans, they're not fanatics. They do want to convert people, but in a mild way. So there is evidence of reproduction, and there is evidence that there is a God.
Thank you for the question. I don't mean to suggest, by the way, that I think all religious people are charlatans, or all religious, or even that all prophets are necessarily charlatans. I do think that the beginnings of wisdom on this issue, though, start with the distinction between the usefulness of a belief and the truth of a belief. There are many, many false beliefs that are beneficial, and and there's now actually considerable evidence that religions played a very important role in human history by helping to generate systems of trust that allowed us to survive some very difficult challenges in our evolutionary past. And I want to make it clear that I respect that religion and the human propensity, the human religious impulse, may very well have played a very important role in benefiting us. But I don't think it follows from that automatically that religious beliefs remain functional or that they remain beneficial for humanity in the same way.
Let's take a question over here. Your hand's been up.
Thanks for both of you coming. My question is regarding, I know you made a statement that history is not a domain of science, and you also made the claim that there's consensus on Jesus as having existed. And I think Professor Norman would probably agree with that, is that there is evidence. how does evidence make sense if history is not a domain of science? And Professor Roman, would you agree that history is not a domain of science because it's something where certainty can't be obtained? And if certainty can't be obtained, does that still mean you can't use the scientific method? Or does that mean that it's equally valid to proposition the Earth is 6,000 years old or 5,000 years old because it's uncertain, versus that maybe it's millions of years old because other people think that evidence does apply to history and that evidence points towards older than 6,000 years?
History is a domain of science and the resurrection.
Okay, look, let me try to take this one really quickly, and then Andy can say something if he wants. So it's important to understand what you mean when you're talking about science. When I use the word science, I mean natural science, what we inherit from the scientific revolution. History is not natural science. End of story. That doesn't mean that natural science cannot discover things about the past. The history is not just the past, okay? History is about what happened in society to individuals and so forth. Science can discover lots of things about the past. That's, by the way, the area where Ken Ham was completely wrong. Since Ken Ham was big. Because you can do repeatable experiments. You can drill ice cores in the Antarctic, and you can look at the layers that represent the different years, and you can go back nearly 1 million years in ice cores. So it's not that the past is not a part of science, it's that history, the understanding of the events of human history, is not a science. Primarily because it's dealing with unique events associated with individuals. But that doesn't mean that history doesn't have real knowledge. We can be very confident about some things in history. We know that Julius Caesar was assassinated on the steps of the Roman Senate, you know, on the Ides of March, 44 BC. We know that. It's a perfectly well-known fact. Okay, history has knowledge. It's just not. It's not the same kind of knowledge as science.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that although history, the discipline of history, doesn't meet the definition of a science as we know it today, but the best historians actually do apply the most rigorous methods they can to achieve accuracy and reliability in the stories they tell about the past. And to that extent, the result of their work can be significantly more true and more illuminating than just, say, educated guesswork or just random, naive opinion. And that represents, and by the way, I think to the extent to which we begin to import the standards of rational accountability that have prevailed in science for millennia into disciplines like history and ethics and jurisprudence and the rest, that represents a form of progress. So while I don't endorse scientism on the way that Dr. Hutchinson defined it, I think it's very much a force for progress to encourage rational accountability in all areas of human endeavor.
Okay. And we have a question from the phone number, which is still up there, by the way. I guess this question is for both of you. How should someone choose between mutually contradictory religious faiths? So we have a bunch of truth claims, they contradict, and so how should you choose among the different options?
The same way you choose between mutually contradictory opinions in any area of your life. You should investigate the evidence and the plausibility of the relative claims. Religious claims are not free from the need to be consciously evaluated. I don't subscribe to the view that faith is blind faith. Faith is not blind faith, at least my faith, I assert, is not blind faith. Maybe there are people who have blind faith. So I would say, it's the content of the religious claims, not the fact that they're religious. It's the content that we have to address and examine. And in the case of Christianity, the place to start would be, to read the New Testament, to try to make sense of it, find out whether you actually think there is plausible reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, as Christians believe.
Dr. Hutchinson, doesn't it follow from that you're actually recommending hypothesis testing in theology, right? You're basically saying scientific method needs to be applied to theological matters so that we can resolve differences of opinion between Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Zoroastrian faiths.
So Andy, I think that you would agree that hypothesis testing is not a good summary of what we might believe to be the methods of science. In fact, of course, it's a very vexed question about how science really functions. And philosophers and historians of science have taken a lot of time to study that. So, of course, we all approach our lives in ways where we try to construct accurate and believable rational explanations of what we experience, of what we see round about us, to enable us to predict what's going to happen in the future. That whole process is not per se, in my view, the natural science. Natural sciences, beyond that, insist upon the necessity for being able to make repeatable experiments or observations and be able to express the results of those observations or experiments with a clarity that enables you to determine whether they're reproducible or not. And that often means measurements, it often means mathematics, classification, and so forth. So I would argue that, yes, there are rational human ways to try to evaluate evidence, but I don't think that those per se turn some question into the science. The reason why this, by the way, is so vexed is that the word science, once upon a time, was used to mean any form of systematic knowledge. That's, after all, the derivation of the word. It comes from the Latin scientia. But the meaning of the word science has changed over history. And so today, that isn't what we mean when we talk about science. Certainly not what I mean, and not what most people mean when they just talk about science. What they mean today is what would once have been called natural philosophy. They're talking about, the things like physics and chemistry and biology and geology and cosmology and things like that. And and for clarity, one can call that natural science. So, of course, history and jurisprudence and philosophy and aesthetics and music all use in many cases, very rigorous forms of reasoning, including hypothesis testing, if you like, to discover the facts that they discover, and so on. Of course, I'm not going to be against that. Rationality is what we're here for.
Here. It might be my weakness, but I'm compelled by people who've had their hands up for the last 15 minutes. There's one right there, there's one in the back, and then there's one right here, and I promise we'll get to you all next, okay?
That's a big
Hi. This is a question about the nature of evidence. So, to Professor Ian Hutchinson, my question is, do you have any other evidence uniquely in favor of Christianity other than the resurrection of Christ? And to Dr. Andy, it would be, would you accept historical evidence in favor of Christianity? So I suppose it's not strictly scientific in the sense that you can't replicate the experiment now, but it's still based on rational inquiry and it's still based on scientific technique.
Should I go first? What do you think? Yeah. Well, okay, there is lots of evidence concerning Christianity, of course, built up over the last 2,000 years. If you're talking about the events of, let's say, the life of Christ, what evidence do we have for those? That is mostly contained in the New Testament documents and the secondary documents that comment on it. Okay, so those are the places you would have to look for the evidence to support or deny the facts that Christians try to follow. If that's the question, that's one thing. I got a sense that perhaps your question was more to do with how do I tell whether Christianity is true or other possible religions. I'm not quite sure whether that was part of your question, but let me just comment on this, that there is a sense in which Christianity is unusual, or maybe even unique, in placing emphasis on the historic aspects of the faith. Christians believe that God has come and revealed himself historically in the person of Jesus, and that means that there's a kind of focal point in history. There are religious faiths that place very little emphasis, in some cases none at all, on history as being part of the evidence for their rationality. Christianity is perhaps unusual in respect of the emphasis that it places on that. You have maybe.
Yeah, I'm no expert on the historicity of the events recounted in the Bible, but I've read enough to believe that the evidence, such as it is far from a conclusive demonstration of Christianity's truth. Perhaps we can agree to differ on that.
We have a question down here, gentleman in the blue striped hat.
I can speak loud. I don't need the mic. So, real quick, thanks for being here. And if any of you want to go grab a beer afterwards, continue this, I'll buy the first round.
Is that open to everybody?
I'm a campus minister. I don't need enough money to buy it. Maybe a miracle can happen. I can turn water into wine. But for you guys, I'd love to hear Dr. Norman and Dr. Hutchinson. It's a question for both of you. For you, Dr. Norman, what has been an argument that has maybe been the greatest challenge to your thought process or caused you to pause and say, I'm going to think through that, and how did you maybe overcome that? And then the same thing for you, for your belief system, Dr. Hutchinson, what has been the greatest challenge to you? And you said, I'm going to think through that, and how did you guys overcome those things?
Okay. Okay, if I take this one?
Yeah, good.
All right. I think the one experience in my life that has done the most to challenge my faith, challenge my worldview. If some of you were here at the Veritas from a couple of years ago, I hope this story may sound familiar. But when I was in high school, I was not a happy camper. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, Andy, why do you never smile?" And I said, "Well, I don't have any reason to smile." And she said, "Hey, Andy, just smile. Try it." Now, my first thought was, that would be dishonest. I don't have enough evidence to smile. Right? But you know what? I decided to give it a go. Leap of faith, if you like. And I just started smiling at people who passed me in the hallways at my high school. And the amazing thing was, they started smiling back. And the world that initially seemed so kind of cold and hostile, and started to feel much friendlier and more welcoming. And I honestly think that particular experience changed my outlook in a profound way. Now, I wouldn't call that anything like religious faith, but it was the voluntary adoption of an attitude, or a facial expression in this case, that helped to change the world in a way that I was having trouble changing given the attitudes I had. Maybe that counts as faith, you can call it that if you like, but knowing that attitudes adopted, even in the face of evidence, can have that power to change your outlook, change your life, is, I think, a powerful reminder to those of us who worry that a blanket invitation to have faith is a bad thing.
We probably have time for two more questions, and actually there are two questions right here on my screen that I think are good for both of our speakers. Oh, but before that, we're going to hear from...
Very quickly, let me just say that I think one of the most difficult and serious challenges to Christian belief is the problem of evil, of pain, suffering. I think that's an important intellectual challenge to understand how it could be that a good God, omnipotent God, would allow there to be suffering as there is in the world. I don't think that question is without an intellectual answer. I think there are good intellectual answers to it. But I think what makes that question so serious is that suffering is a reality. You know, there are people who suffer, and probably there are people in this room, you know, who are either suffering or know people in their family or in their close friends who are suffering. And so any answer to that question is from an existential point of view, rather than from an intellectual point of view, comes short of the mark, because there is, in a certain sense, no answer for suffering when we face it up front, other than to be alongside the suffering person and to have compassion on them. And I think actually that ties into the intellectual side of it, is that Christians believe that God has acted in that way in respect of suffering altogether in the world. That's a bigger question.
And now we have time for one last question. Go ahead. Oh, you've been holding the mic for a while. Okay, go ahead.
I would like to posit that science is a tool, and it is one that is very good at answering questions such as how and what, but that on its own it cannot stand up to questions like why or should, and that any way you slice it, we do have to answer these questions unless science is to become a simple acquisition of knowledge for knowledge's own sake. And so, in that sense, what should we use to decide what science will do?
I don't think that's a question. I agree with it.
Okay. Then it is a question to you, Adrian.
Oh, okay.
So the idea that science can answer what and how questions, but not address why questions, I think has gained a large degree of currency. But I'm not sure that's true. I mean, for one thing, we know science can give us an answer to the question why the Earth revolves around the sun. So just at a first approximation level, science does give us answers to why questions. And in fact, I think there are many such things. But to understand your question in a more sympathetic light, right? You're asking about purpose and meaning, and can science shed light on whether there is purpose or meaning? I actually am increasingly of the view that it can. It seems to me that a scientific outlook has clarified the following facts, all of which serve to clarify what really matters. Actions and differences that make no difference for the well-being of sentient creatures, of conscious creatures, arguably don't matter. But behaviors, things, and attitudes that do make a difference for sentient creatures do matter. And the question of what matters, then, can be resolved in part by looking at the world and studying it empirically to determine what makes a difference for creatures that can experience things. In other words, science, as we know it today, can shed a great deal of light on what matters, which is to say what is meaningful. And I think the more we adopt that attitude, the more we can overcome some of the subjective differences. I mean, there's an ideology at large right now that says there's no rational way to resolve differences between ethical differences or differences about what's meaningful, because it's ultimately just a subjective choice. I think that's a destructive ideology that prevents us from having genuine dialogues about what really matters to us. And we need to learn how to dialogue together about what matters to us, and there are increasingly well understood methods for answering those questions. And if you don't want to call them scientific, call them they at least embody the spirit of science, the spirit of scientific inquiry.
Wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone. the student MC to come back and join us, I wanted to give each of you one last opportunity for a brief closing statement, if you will. We started with Andy. Ian, can we start with you?
Sure. We have to live our lives as best we can with the knowledge, with the evidence, with the understanding that we have. And that's what I would advocate, and I'm sure that that's what Andy would advocate. The question, though, implied by the discussion topic that we've been addressing is that science has a special place to play in that. Perhaps it does. I'm a scientist. I think science is tremendously important and that we should pursue it and thereby gain the understanding that it provides of our natural world. But I also think that there are many, many areas of our lives, of our world, that are outside of the competence of science, understood as natural science, and that we need to use other approaches to understand those, including understandings that are based on spiritual and religious questions. I have found in my life there to be a reality associated with following Jesus Christ that is constructive, that has enabled me to live a meaningful life in a way which I think is true, not merely convenient or helpful. And I think there are millions of other people in the world over history who have found the same. And I am proud, therefore, to call myself a Christian. And I believe that Christianity is not irrational. It's not faith-based in contradiction to evidence-based. It is a trust in a reality.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, I'll keep this short. It does seem to me that if you evaluate the pros and cons of adopting a faithful attitude, you should become sensitive to a range of ways in which faithful attitudes are destructive of scientific attitudes and destructive of many things we care about. And so I would urge many of you who value open-mindedness and the scientific spirit to consider following in Ryan Bell's footsteps and to take a leap of faithlessness and see. Many of us have found such leaps to be enormously liberating, and I'd encourage you to give it a try if you haven't yet.
Again, let's thank our
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.